الجامعات الأمريكية والأوروبية اشتعلت للمطالبة بوقف الحرب على غزة. اتسعت الاحتجاجات على امتداد خريطة الجامعات في الولايات المتحدة وفرنسا وبريطانيا وألمانيا وغيرها. خيم الطلاب في ساحات الجامعات، غيروا بتعبيراتهم الرمزية العميقة أسماء المباني، رفعوا الشعارات الجذرية التي ترفض أي تعامل لجامعاتهم مع كيان الاحتلال، انتصروا لفلسطين، رفضوا الإبادة الجماعية والتطهير العرقي الذي تمارسه إسرائيل.
I think even though we aren't in Palestine, we are watching a genocide unfold live. And so we care about our siblings in Palestine, and we care about the global community. And the United States is extremely complicit in this genocide.
After that, there's been a ton of coordination, both informal, and then there are more formal bodies like, say, London Student Action for Palestine. There's it's not student specific, but there's a Palestine Solidarity Network. There's all these affinity groups where people are meeting and sharing ideas and sharing strategies.
Students are very trained to recognize when there's tropes of racism or when something represents colonization.
La mobilisation pour les Palestiniens a été retombée parce que les médias n'en parlaient pas, parce qu'il y avait d'autres préoccupations, etc. Mais là, il y a une renaissance de cette solidarité et donc toute une série de questions sur comment analyser cette question palestinienne.
تعرض المئات منهم للاعتقال والاحتجاز. شارك العديد من الأكاديميين وأعضاء هيئة التدريس طلابهم في الاحتجاج. كانت الحركة تنمو بتسارع لتؤثر في فئات المجتمع وتكون الأكثر زخما في تحركاته الاحتجاجية. كيف بدأ كل ذلك؟ وكيف تدحرجت كرة الثلج التي أرقت أوروبا والولايات المتحدة أشهرا؟ ما معنى الزخم الذي أنتجته هذه الاحتجاجات الطالبية؟ وكيف تختلف عن باقي التجارب التي شهدها تاريخ الحركة الطلابية في الغرب؟ سحب الاستثمارات الجامعية من الشركات التي تدعم الاحتلال كان الشعار الأبرز في هذه الاحتجاجات. وسائل الإعلام الغربية وعدد من الاقتصاديين ردوا على مطالبات الطلاب بوقف الاستثمار أن هذه الاستثمارات ليست مؤثرة كما يعتقدون. آخرون قالوا إن سحب الاستثمارات عملية مركبة وغير ممكنة. كان رد الطلاب واضحا وصريحا: القيمة الأخلاقية للجامعة تعلو على كل شيء، لذلك يجب سحب الاستثمارات. واعتبروا أيضا أن هذه الاستثمارات مؤثرة وقد تشكل عامل ضغط جديا على الاحتلال. يقول موقع جلوبس ووفقا لإحصائية صادرة عام 2020 عن موقع كريمسون أن 200 مليون دولار جرى استثمارها من قبل جامعة هارفارد في الشركات الإسرائيلية، وأن الاستثمارات الجامعية تدخل في صناعة الرقائق لشركات مثل نوفا وكامتك وشركات السايبر وحتى في بورصة تل أبيب.
And so we occupied the Marshall Building, which we renamed the Marshall Bloom Building in honor of an anti-apartheid activist in LSE who protested against apartheid in Rhodesia. We occupied this building, calling on the university to divest from these activities, particularly from crimes against the Palestinian people, as well as a host of other demands, including disaffiliation from, universities affiliated with the Israeli military and armed forces, and international human rights violations, all the way to calling for scholarships for Palestinian people and the university's support for reconstruction in Gaza.
Our university will not disclose specific investments, but we know for a fact that they are invested in organizations that make weapons for the United States military and thus are transported to Israel. We know that they support Zionist companies and companies that are supporting Israel. And a lot of their major personal funders, a lot of the people who would donate out of their own pockets, donate huge amounts of money, are huge Zionists who support Israel completely and don't believe Palestinians are human. They've said absolutely atrocious stuff about us, atrocious stuff about Palestine and Palestinians. And these sort of investments and the ability to, and the fact that our university is accepting these donations and investing in Israel is absolutely unacceptable.
At the first level, there are academic programs that universities organize with Israeli institutions that are involved in supporting or in educating aspects of the occupation. Those can be student exchange programs with certain universities that have ties to the military industry in Israel. They can also be exchange programs for faculty and for others, not just for students.
This morning, Columbia University's presidents had talks between student protesters and school officials to dismantle the protest encampment on campus, ended without an agreement. Protesters are calling for the university to divest from investments connected to Israel, but President Manoush Shafik said they will not do that.
As we just heard, Brown University announced today it will vote on divestment this fall. But how difficult would it be for other schools to divest from Israel? Last night, we heard a perspective arguing that it can be done more readily.
Columbia's pro-Palestinian encampment triggered similar student protests across the country and renewed calls for universities to divest themselves of investments in Israel and companies profiting from the Israeli war in Gaza.
It's the most intense and contentious debate that I've seen over how university endowments should be invested.
But at a higher level, universities have huge investment funds, which they try to grow as a way to build more revenue for the universities. And they invest in a whole range of stocks and bonds. So there could be Israeli government bonds that universities actually own, and those directly benefit the government and the economy of Israel.
Il y a eu le même type de demande, mais avec une différence, c'est que il n'y a pas d'investissement. Les universités en France sont pas riches, elles n'ont pas des fonds qui leur permettent d'investir ou donc elles ne sont pas propriétaires d'entreprises qui travaillent dans les territoires occupés ou en Israël, etc. Mais l'idée de stopper, ou en tous les cas de réviser la coopération entre les universités françaises et les universités israéliennes était très importante.
Funding that goes into companies that are complicit in the ongoing occupation, like Airbnb, Booking.com, weapons companies that fund the ongoing genocide, and so on. And the other thing too is kind of the ideological smokescreen, the ideological background that allows the status quo to keep happening is oftentimes produced by these universities that say, oh, we want to take political stances. The university is a place of inquiry. It's a place of free expression that doesn't take sides. And we wanted to interrupt that and say, no, by the fact that you are investing money into companies that arm apartheid in Palestine, that profit off of the genocide in Gaza, that makes you part of the architecture. You're not neutral. So all these things lead us as a movement to say, this isn't separate from us. We recognize that our fight and our location in the British Empire, is fundamentally interconnected to the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation.
Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free! From the river to the sea! From the river to the sea!
مما لا شك فيه أن طوفان الأقصى أعاد اللهيب إلى القضية الفلسطينية في العالم. وللمناسبة، الحديث عن مسألة الاعتراف بالدولة الفلسطينية أو التعبير الأوروبي عن حل الدولتين وغيرهما كان السقف الأدنى من هذا النقاش. الحركات الطالبية ذهبت إلى ما هو أبعد من ذلك، إلى شعار فلسطين من البحر إلى النهر، بمعنى التفكيك الكامل للكيان السياسي والعسكري للاحتلال. حاولت وسائل الإعلام الغربية تصدير الشعار بطريقة مختلفة، أن تبنيه يعني إبادة اليهود، ولكنها ربما صدمت بالوعي الطالبي الذي يعرف الفرق جيدا بين إبادة البشر والتفكيك لمؤسسات كيان الاحتلال.
From the river to the sea has been such a controversial slogan in the U.S. because it's being misconstrued by supporters of Israel as a call for the elimination of the Jewish population. But what's happening on campuses is that students are using the slogan as a call for Palestinian freedom. And Zionists will conflate these two, freedom and elimination, because they have set up an occupation and an apartheid system.
Like, I'll share what From the River to the Sea has kind of how I've refined my understanding of it. And for me, it's fundamentally a call for the liberation of the Palestinian people throughout the entirety of their ancestral homeland, you know, and that is what From the River to the Sea means. And that means not parceling up Palestine according to plans like, say, you know, the 47, forgive me, I'm getting the date wrong, UN partition plan, which people will often now go and say, oh, look, here's a model for a two-state solution, the UN partition plan. And actually, I don't think people go that far anymore, but historically, people will point to that. But the thing is that early partition plan was not consented to by the majority indigenous population. And so how can we have any partition plan that is legitimate when the majority of the indigenous population did not consent to it? Same for kind of like the later partition plans that are based kind of on the situation on the ground after 1967, after the war in which Israel occupied, you know, large swaths of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and so on. And so From the River to the Sea is kind of, to me, it's first of all an appeal to the historic entirety of the indigenous land of Palestine.
Le slogan la Palestine sera libre de la mer au fleuve, elle pose des questions de l'avenir, de comment on va construire une Palestine, comment on va construire une Palestine dans laquelle aujourd'hui, en tous les cas, sur le territoire historique, il y a 7,5 millions de Juifs israéliens, 7,5 millions de Palestiniens. Donc, il y a toute une série de questions qui se posent sur la solution. Et c'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, personne ne voit une solution. D'un côté, les deux États, c'est une incantation par les gouvernements, mais tout le monde sait que c'est impossible à appliquer tellement Israël a développé la colonisation en Cisjordanie et à Jérusalem-Est. Mais en même temps, la solution à un État, c'est une utopie. C'est-à-dire, une utopie, ça peut être positif, mais personne ne voit comment ça peut être appliqué.
في بداية التحركات الاحتجاجية في الغرب ضد الحرب الإسرائيلية على قطاع غزة، لم تكن التحركات الطالبية تشكل النسبة الكبرى من مجمل هذه الاحتجاجات، ولكنها لاحقاً وتحديداً في شهري نيسان أبريل وأيار مايو كانت قد استحوذت على المشهد. بحسب موقع بيانات النزاع المسلح أكلي داتا، فإن الحركات الطالبية التي شكلت 33% من مجمل الاحتجاجات في الولايات المتحدة في تشرين الأول أكتوبر 2023 باتت تشكل 92% منها في بداية أيار مايو 2024. بحسب مركز ASH للحكم الديمقراطي والابتكار في جامعة هارفارد، نشرت مجموعة من الإحصائيات بشأن الاحتجاجات الطالبية في الولايات المتحدة، ومن ذلك منذ 7 تشرين الأول أكتوبر إلى شهر أيار مايو 2024 شهدت الجامعات الأمريكية 3700 احتجاج طالبي في 525 كلية وجامعة ومدرسة ثانوية على امتداد أكثر من 317 مدينة أمريكية. وشهد شهر أيار مايو القفزة الكبيرة في تخييم الطلبة كجزء من أشكال التعبير والاحتجاج. تبقى الأسئلة كثيرة حول آلية عمل هذه الاحتجاجات، كيف حدث كل ذلك، وماذا عن التنسيق بين المجموعات الطالبية والجامعات المختلفة، وكيف ساندت الهيئة الأكاديمية التحرك، كيف دعمت المنظمات تحركات الطلبة من خارج أسوار الحرم الجامعي سواء في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أو في بريطانيا أم في فرنسا.
Our first encampment started with about 60 people who were willing to get arrested and maybe 30 or 40 people who were supporting in other ways. And by the time we got arrested, I would say over 300 students had surrounded the encampment to support Palestine, and we had 108 students get arrested. I think the more the university pushed back against us, the more students were willing to support Palestine.
There was a lot of coordination. I think a lot of it, first of all, was kind of setting the ground and just helping this feel possible. Seeing other universities set up their encampments in places like Queen Mary, King's College, Oxford, really all over the United Kingdom and all over the world. That empowered us at LSE to go and say, this is something we can do, because we were quite nervous. I think a couple of different things that made our situation a little bit different planning wise than maybe some of the campuses, say, in the United States are, one, the student intifada are calling it was happening in spring term, and in the UK education system, spring term is, at least at LSE, it's not a teaching term. And so we were worried there wouldn't be a lot of students on campus to come through. Another thing is that there are a lot of international students at LSE. I think it's actually a majority international students in terms of the makeup of our movement. And so we were really worried about repression and legal consequences. And so just seeing other universities kind of and other movements go in and take this principled risk for the Palestinian people, I think really inspired us.
So Colombia, we had time to plan ahead for our protests, for our encampments, because we were one of the first. And so we have put a lot of support into the other Students for Justice in Palestine organizations. We've worked with them and gotten ideas from them, and just tried to make sure that these protests run as smoothly as possible. I also think a lot of us on a personal basis are helping our friends who are organizers around the country. I have friends who are organizers in Washington, D.C. I have friends who are organizers in Michigan, which is where I live. And so personally, a lot of us have acquaintances and friends that we, of course, want to help organize, because it's so important that we are so intentional and well-spoken, because in general, Zionists will go after any mistake we make. So there's been a lot of collaboration in the United States between these universities, and a lot of just attempting to support each other, attempting to support students who go to jail because of this.
Toward the latter end of the summer, we started seeing universities, including LSE, try and kind of evict protesters and end these camps through legal actions. So it would be like, okay, could you come and support us outside the courthouse? Or even could you help us kind of with legal strategy? We had a really incredible legal team working on kind of how to navigate the pros and cons of engaging at the court level. And then we shared a lot of that insight with other encampments, and other encampments shared their insight with us. Same with kind of negotiation strategy. That's something where there was a lot of knowledge sharing between camps. And again, things as fundamental and simple as bringing food over, showing support, attending workshops together, doing teach-ins, just like being there. So there's tons and tons of connections and conversations and really and material shows of support between various encampments.
There's a lot of environmental activists who themselves have been pursuing divestment, who turned up to support Palestine during these protests. Also, there's a lot of students pushing for African American representation on campuses, and you saw a lot of that same student body present at these protests as well. So I would say that there were a lot of interconnections between the ceasefire protests and other progressive student causes.
We had a lot of support from a variety of organizations. Of course, Palestine Legal has been absolutely amazing. We've also had clubs like Black Lives Matter or Black Student Union have solidarity with us and have brought forward some major leaders. And we've also had Native students, so Native American students, so the people who are indigenous to the Americas, have been extremely supportive of Palestine. The other club that's been extremely supportive is Young Democratic Socialists of America. And that club has been mostly supportive. We've just had amazing support. We had probably close to 300 students trying to protect the encampment, and 108 people got arrested the first time. So it's been just like an outpouring of support, and more students care about Palestine. More and more students are learning about Palestine, and more students are asking questions. And it's just so amazing to see.
C'est surtout la France insoumise, qui est le parti de Jean-Luc Mélenchon, qui a été le plus actif dans la mobilisation politique, mais aussi c'est celui qui a été le plus dénoncé par les autres forces politiques, y compris parfois par les forces de gauche. Mais disons que le mouvement a été aussi, c'est-à-dire c'était pas un mouvement seulement des forces politiques, il y a les associations de solidarité, il y a, disons, les associations traditionnelles de solidarité avec la Palestine, comme l'association France-Palestine Solidarité, et puis il y a des collectifs qui s'appellent notamment Urgence Palestine, qui ont mobilisé notamment la jeunesse issue, comme on dit, de l'immigration, et qui ont été aussi très actifs.
I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you right now?
Yes, can you call the philosophy department office and tell them I've been requesting?
Philosophy department?
Yes, call the philosophy department office.
I will. What's your...
I'm chair of the philosophy department.
I got you.
I was stationed over there. I walked towards the flagpole because I saw something going on with a bunch of police had tackled a young person and threw them on the ground and were just pummeling them. Just pummeling. And the mother in me said, stop. And I made sure to stand 4 feet away from them. And I'm standing still in a non-confrontational way. I said, stop. And then when the cop stood up and got right in front of me and said, ma'am, you need to step back. You need to step back. And I was watching them pummel somebody. I said, no. And they arrested me.
عنف الشرطة ضد الاحتجاجات الطالبية كان مركبا، فهو لم يستهدف الطلاب فقط، وإنما أيضا أعضاء الهيئات الأكاديمية. طال الاعتقال والتحفظ أو الاحتجاز المئات من الطلبة والمدرسين. ومع أن الجامعات الغربية تضمن حرية التعبير نظريا على الأقل، إلا أن عددا من الطلاب تعرض للفصل، إضافة إلى أن عددا من المدرسين فقدوا وظائفهم ووجهت إليهم التهم بخرق القانون وقواعد السلوك في الجامعة. ربما كان هنالك تباين في مستوى عنف الشرطة وعدد المحتجزين بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وفرنسا وبريطانيا، وربما أن الحالة في الولايات المتحدة كانت الأشد قسوة، إلا أن ما يمكن استنتاجه اليوم هو أن حالة القمع الأمنية الغربية بدأت تتعاظم وترتفع. فمن قمع فرنسا الاحتجاجات للسترات الصفر، وقمع الشرطة الأمريكية للاحتجاجات بعد مقتل جورج فلويد، وصولا إلى لحظة احتجاجات الجامعات، نلاحظ ارتفاعا جديدا وكبيرا في منسوب العنف الأمني والشرطي الغربي الأوروبي والأمريكي على حد سواء. تتحدث منظمة العفو الدولية عن 3 حقائق فيما يتعلق بقمع الشرطة الأمريكية. أولا، لا توجد ولاية أمريكية واحدة تتبع القانون الدولي بشأن استخدام القوة المميتة من قبل أفراد الشرطة. في حالات كثيرة الموت سببه إطلاق عيار ناري من قبل الشرطة. قد يطلق رجل الشرطة النار أكثر من مرة على الشخص نفسه.
So both of my arrests have been like both of my charges were dropped because there was not a legal basis for them. Our university president, Manu Shafiq, called the police unilaterally and then told them what to charge us with. So we were charged with trespassing on our own university as people with student IDs who had a right to be there. And that was also my second charge. Charges outside of New York City or outside of our school have been also disorderly conduct. And we did have students as well who were charged with felonies and misdemeanors. And thankfully, the majority of those charges have also been dropped because the prosecutors and the judge found that there was not sufficient evidence. I was in jail the first time for maybe 17 hours and the second time for maybe 4. My first arrest was done properly by the police. However, they didn't have a right to hold us. My second arrest was extremely violent, and I am still injured from it. And that was the case for many of us.
So faculty have faced different kinds of sanctions. Those who don't have much job protection and have on occasion faced violence, not just from police, but also from pro-Israeli activists in the community. But they've faced some job sanctions, including being stricken from teaching. Their classes were taken away from some of them. Some of them have been suspended or fired. So there was some cases, high-profile cases of oppression. Of course, this is not that new in U.S. academia. You can go back to the 1970s and the 1980s and see cases of professors being fired for saying the wrong thing about Israel.
One big difference between how things have played out in the United Kingdom and the United States for a lot of encampments, including ours, is that a lot of the time the schools have, like LSE, did not go straight to the police. Yeah, LSE actually went through the courts. And so the kind of repression that we were facing, that we did face, that led to our eviction, was a kind of legal repression where LSE kind of went and said, you're trespassers on our private property and we're going to bring you to court to threaten you to leave. And so that's kind of one difference in the emphasis or the strategy of LSE. But of course, there has been, police repression in the United Kingdom as in the United States. Just, I think it might have been yesterday or a couple of days ago, 7, I believe, comrades from SOAS University were arrested, after Zionist counter-protesters called cops on them. And, someone like a disabled person had to have their crutches, I think, kicked out or hit out from them, and awful stuff going on and showing the kind of repression that we're facing. Or in many ways, the violence has been, specifically targeted towards our Muslim siblings, as I mentioned, kind of the forced removal of jobs and the kind of interruption of prayer. So we've dealt with a lot of that.
La question de la violence policière, c'est une très vieille question en France. Elle s'est accentuée depuis quelques années avec la lutte. Vous savez, en France, on a connu de grandes luttes sociales contre la réforme des retraites, contre la réforme de l'assurance chômage, qui étaient des réformes qui mettaient en cause les droits des travailleurs en France. Et ça a suscité depuis 15 ans d'immenses manifestations. Et on a vu petit à petit augmenter la violence de la répression pour tous ces mouvements de contestation. Je veux dire, on est sans doute le pays en Europe de l'Ouest, où la violence policière est la plus importante. En plus, on a une violence spécifique dirigée contre les jeunes des banlieues, c'est-à-dire les jeunes d'origine musulmane ou arabe, avec beaucoup de gens qui sont tués, etc. Donc, on est déjà dans un climat de violence. Et évidemment, il y a une répression contre les manifestations de soutien à la Palestine, mais elles n'ont pas été plus importantes que ce qui se tombe sur le reste du mouvement social depuis quelques années. C'est une dérive autoritaire qu'il y a du pouvoir et qui, qui a amené à un usage de la police, des forces de police totalement disproportionné.
UCLA's campus was packed with a heavy police presence on Wednesday after violent clashes erupted overnight between supporters of Israel and pro-Palestinian demonstrators. Footage from the early hours on Wednesday showed a firework being thrown into the pro-Palestinian protest camp. More witness footage from UCLA, which was verified by Reuters, showed people wielding sticks or poles to hammer on wooden boards being used as makeshift barricades to protect the pro-Palestinian protesters before police were deployed to the campus.
Are telling us this morning that in the overnight hours, pro-Israel protesters moved in on the pro-Palestinian protesters and the encampment that has been there for some time. It appears to have started with scuffles over metal railings. And as you can see from these aerial images, it quickly escalated into fighting. Now, there's no sound on these images, but you can clearly make out the two sides here, one appearing to be on the attack, the other attempting to hold them off. One thing you won't see in this video is any sign of campus police or of officers from the Los Angeles Police Department.
يذكر مشروع بيانات النزاع المسلح الأمريكي أكلي داتا أن 94% من التظاهرات في الولايات المتحدة كانت مؤيدة لفلسطين، وتذكر مصادر أخرى نسبا أعلى من ذلك، ولكن النسبة القليلة جدا المؤيدة للإبادة الجماعية اندفعت هي الأخرى إلى الشوارع للاعتداء على الاحتجاجات السلمية المؤيدة لفلسطين، وهاجمت خيم الطلاب. تقول دراسة بعنوان انحياز الإعلام ضد غزة 2023-2024 لمركز مراقبة الإعلام إن الإعلام الغربي حاول إظهار الطلاب كمخربين أو إرهابيين أو خطر على اليهود في الدول الغربية، وأنهم ضد القيم البريطانية مثلا، وأنهم طبعا معادون للسامية. يلعب اللوبي الإسرائيلي دورا كبيرا في كل ذلك، بل إن له أنشطة كثيفة تاريخيا في الجامعات في تتبع المدرسين والطلاب الذين يتبنون آراء معادية لإسرائيل واستحداث مواقع للتشهير بهم وإيذائهم أيضا.
We've just experienced extreme violence from Zionists. They have used chemical weapons against us, like the students. We had some Zionist students, one of whom was formerly in the Israeli occupation forces, detonated a chemical weapon that led to students being in the hospital. We've had Zionists say some of the most horrific things I've ever heard to us. And I do believe that the university supports them more than us because the university hasn't punished them a single time.
There's a lot of pressure by graduates of universities to stop donating to the universities. There's also very wealthy donors, some of whom might have buildings bearing their names on campuses that can put a lot of pressure, especially through boards of trustees, who are kind of like the boards that run the universities, because universities are nonprofit or they're public. And when they're public universities, the state government falls under a lot of pressure by lobby groups who seek to mobilize the university administrations to repress student activism. So there's a lot of very powerful pressure being put on universities to silence student activism.
Malheureusement, la campagne médiatique a créé l'impression que tous ces mouvements étaient antisémites. Il y a eu quelques provocations faites par des associations sionistes pour faire croire qu'il y avait de l'antisémitisme. Je veux dire, s'il y en avait, c'était totalement marginal. Donc, les associations ont essayé notamment en sciences politiques, je veux dire, ont essayé de mener une campagne dans les médias, etc. Mais l'accès aux médias n'est pas très facile. Sur la scène politique, la victime la plus importante de cette accusation d'antisémitisme, c'était le parti de Jean-Luc Mélenchon, qui a évidemment contesté à juste titre, parce qu'on ne peut absolument pas soupçonner ces gens d'antisémitisme, mais qui a quand même été attaqué et je pense en partie affaibli. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a une partie des gens qui pensent que c'est aujourd'hui qu'il a des tendances antisémites.
I'm Martin Shaw and I wrote a book called What is Genocide?
I wanted
to bring Benny back to Gaza because he said it's a war and there's collateral damage and that Hamas knew. And that may be true, but I mean the real point is that Israel knew. isn't it? That if you bend the rules of war so that 100 people can be killed for one militant, if you do that thousands and thousands of times with 2,000-pound bombs, you know that the whole of Gaza is going to be a ruin. You know that you're going to destroy that society. And that the only way we can understand that in an overall sense, it's not a series of war crimes. It is one big crime, and I think the name for that is genocide.
You're boring. You're actually quite boring. Racist! I'd rather be a racist than a bore.
Shame!
We recently had Benny Morris invited onto campus for a conversation with the law school. And Benny Morris, he's an Israeli historian, but also really well known for his hateful, Islamophobic, racist rhetoric, kind of dehumanizing the Palestinian people, making these broad civilizational claims about the kind of savagery of Arab civilization. These things, which are really patently and painfully racist and essentially by and let someone like this be given a platform. And so there are these different ways in which I would say that the university is structurally kind of opposed to addressing Islamophobia and racism that really disproportionately targets Palestinians.
الانحياز في الجامعات الغربية ضد فلسطين، هل هو انحياز مؤسسي تنظيمي وهيكلي؟ أم أنه أيضا انحياز على مستوى المناهج الدراسية والحرية الأكاديمية؟ نحن نعرف أن الدراسة في هذه الجامعات هي هدف للكثير من الطلبة لما تتمتع به من سمعة وخطط دراسية جذابة. كيف يمكن لهذه الجامعات التي تسعى إلى تعزيز التفكير النقدي أن تقمع مواقف الطلبة الذين يدرسون فيها، ولا سيما كليات العلوم الاجتماعية والإنسانية والتاريخ والفلسفة وغيرها؟ في مشهدية خذلت الحركة الطلابية وخذلت معها عنوان التضامن مع غزة، جلست رئيسة جامعة كولومبيا نعمة شفيق تبرر موقفها وتدافع عن منصبها، والسؤال المتكرر هو نفسه: هل ما يحدث في جامعتكم هو معاداة للسامية؟
So I want to start with you, Dr. Shafiq. What is your definition of anti-Semitism?
For me personally, any discrimination against people for their Jewish faith is anti-Semitism.
Okay, I appreciate that. You set up a task force. Do they share that same definition?
Congresswoman, I know the chair of our task force is sitting next to me.
You're the president. I'd like to hear from you first.
I'm happy to answer the question. So I know he would also.
And I'm happy to do that, but I'd like to start with you, since you are the president, right? You own, the buck stops with you, right?
Completely.
Do they share that same definition?
I'm pretty sure that they would share that definition.
No, you think that would be a pretty important thing to start with?
Yes.
Okay.
Degree program, I didn't research exactly what you teach, but are you familiar with Genesis 12:3?
Probably not as well as you are, Congressman.
Well, it's pretty clear it was the covenant that God made with Abraham. And that covenant was real clear. If you bless Israel, I will bless you. If you curse Israel, I will curse you. And then in the New Testament, it was confirmed that all nations would be blessed through you. So you do not know about that.
I have heard that now that you've explained it. Yes,
so
I've heard that
it's
before.
now familiar. Do you consider that a serious issue? I mean, do you want Columbia University to be cursed by God of the Bible?
Definitely not.
Okay.
There's a lot of variation in what students are exposed to at different universities, different faculty. And, there's a range of the extent to which faculty put their personal opinions into the classroom or their personal views. But generally, I would say that an education in the humanities or an education in social science equips students to be more critical. But a lot of these students have that training to ask questions about things that they're told. And they apply that to the U.S. media and its pro-Israeli news coverage. And so they don't just buy what they're told because that's kind of what they're trained to do. I think that that's sort of the biggest bias about social science. And in the humanities, one of the things that students learn is to have empathy and compassion with people who are different from themselves. And that's why they can relate to or feel sympathy for Palestinians in Gaza, even if they're not Palestinian or Muslim or have any other kind of identity connection with that part of the world.
في ظل التحركات الطالبية، ماذا كان موقف شباب وطلاب الأحزاب الكبرى؟ الجمهوري والديمقراطي في الولايات المتحدة، العمال والمحافظين في بريطانيا، الأحزاب المتنوعة في فرنسا التي شهدت تحولا إلى اليمين أكثر طبعا ودعم إسرائيل بعد عام 2001. تقول إحصائية صادرة عن مركز البحوث قالوا إن هناك انخفاضا حادا في نسبة الشباب الأمريكيين المؤيدين لإسرائيل من 64% إلى 38% فقط عام 2023. إذن ما الذي يمكن أن ينتجه هذا التحول على مستوى نشاط الفئة الشابة في هذه الأحزاب؟
There should be a debate between the parties. At the older generations, there's unfortunately still a lot of support for Israel and lack of support for Palestinian rights. But at the youth level, you're seeing young Democrats taking a much more progressive position and being vocal and calling for a ceasefire and paying much more attention to Palestinian suffering in Gaza. And so there's really a split at the youth level. The Republican Party youth are pro-Israel, and the Democratic Party youth are much more sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause and plight.
Unfortunately, both the Republican and Democratic Party in the United States are Zionist. Both the Democratic leader and the Republican leader in the U.S. are extremely in support of Israel, and we've had pushback from Democrats and Republicans alike. We've had threats of violence from politicians in both parties. So it makes us uncomfortable voting for like these presidential elections.
Jusqu'en 2001, on considère la question palestinienne comme un problème d'occupation. Il y a une occupation illégale de la Cisjordanie, de Gaza, de Jérusalem-Est, et la France se bat contre cette occupation. À partir de 2001, ce qui va prévaloir petit à petit, c'est l'idée que la Palestine est un des fronts de la guerre contre le terrorisme. Et que dans cette guerre contre le terrorisme, Israël est l'allié de la France. Et on assiste à un changement qui parfois est surprenant, c'est-à-dire on oublie les Républicains, qui est, disons, l'opposition de droite aujourd'hui à Macron, est censé être l'héritier direct de De Gaulle, du parti gaulliste. Et pourtant, c'est un parti aujourd'hui qui réclame le transfert de l'ambassade de France à Jérusalem. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qui était les traditions impulsées par De Gaulle en 67 ont disparu maintenant.
October of 67, and we were with the Cornell contingent, and I remember seeing friends being pulled by the soldiers who had bayonets between the lines. And I remember going back to where we were staying in some alum's house and shaking like a leaf and saying, we're going to get killed.
31 students, women and men, were sent to the hospital with injuries, and we quickly began organizing for a march the following morning, numbering 4,000 angry PSU students and faculty members, to march on Portland City Hall to peacefully protest the police attack of May 11th.
More than 50 years later.
ليس جديدا أن يحدث هذا النوع من الاحتجاجات الطالبية في الولايات المتحدة. وبالعودة إلى الوراء أكثر من 50 عاما، الأرشيف ما زال يحتفظ بالتحركات الطالبية ضد الحرب الأمريكية على فيتنام. ولكن حين ذاك كان تضرر الطلاب الأمريكيين من الحرب مباشرا. أولا، وعود الرئيس الأمريكي ليندون جونسون بانتعاش للأوضاع الاقتصادية الأمريكية اصطدمت بالإنفاق العسكري على الحرب ضد فيتنام. ثانيا، قلق الطلاب الأمريكيين من دعوتهم للخدمة الإلزامية. وثالثا، كان لهؤلاء الطلاب أقارب وأصدقاء معرضون لخطر الموت في ساحات القتال العنيفة في فيتنام. ولكن ماذا عن الاحتجاجات الطالبية المطالبة بوقف الحرب على غزة؟ لماذا انطلقت بهذه القوة مع أنها لا تعرض مواطني الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أقله بشكل مباشر إلى الخطر؟
What's so astounding about the protests recently over the U.S. support for Israel in its war against Gaza is that a lot of students aren't directly impacted in the same ways that previous generations or on these major issues. So this is really a movement of solidarity, one that's driven by anger and compassion, by what we're seeing on these screens on social media, for example. I think that unlike these previous cases also, students have much more access to voices from the ground, thanks to the courageous work of journalists in Gaza who risked their lives to bring images of death and destruction all around them.
I would actually say that it isn't outside our borders, so to speak. And I mean this in a couple of different ways. First, I think most primarily is the United Kingdom is historically and contemporarily entangled in the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people, and was one of the chief, if not the chief colonial power behind the kind of historical development of settler colonialism in Palestine. It was the United Kingdom through Secretary Balfour who kind of set aside, this land, which was inhabited by a diverse group of, indigenous communities, and said, okay, now we're going to set this aside for the Zionist settler project. But then, of course, in the present day, the United Kingdom continues to be one of the main allies and backers of the settler colonial Zionist regime occupying Palestine.
Je crois que la première chose qui a attisé la mobilisation étudiante, c'est l'ampleur des massacres à Gaza. C'est-à-dire que malgré le fait que les premiers mois, on n'a pas vu grand-chose sur les télévisions françaises sur la destruction de Gaza, petit à petit, c'est venu. Les télévisions ont été obligées de montrer quelques images. On a vu la réunion de la Cour internationale de justice, de la Cour pénale internationale, les déclarations d'Amnesty International, du secrétaire général des Nations Unies, etc.
The Columbia strike may have reminded people of the Paris Commune, but May '68 in France was the real thing. What began as a student protest for reform of the archaic, authoritarian French university system sparked a general strike that electrified the country.
They were anarchists, most of them. That was the spirit. The slogan was all power to the imagination.
كما أثرت شرارة الاحتجاجات الطالبية في الولايات المتحدة على تحريك الاحتجاجات الطالبية في أوروبا، فإن الكثير من المحللين استعادوا ذاكرة الثورة الطالبية الشهيرة عام 1968 في فرنسا. حين ذاك احتلت الشرطة الفرنسية الحي اللاتيني في باريس، وامتدت الاحتجاجات الطالبية في خلال أيام قليلة إلى المصانع ومواقع العمل من كل نوع. في بعض الحالات كان هذا الانتشار عفويا، وفي أحيان أخرى أدرك الطلبة الذين أوقفوا العمل فعليا في الجامعات أنهم بلا حول ما لم تجري إعادة إنتاج أفعالهم عبر كل مجالات الحياة الاجتماعية، فطلبوا الدعم من العمال. وهذا ما حدث في إضراب 13 من أيار مايو الذي شل فرنسا تماما. هل كان من الممكن لهذه الاحتجاجات الطالبية أن تترك أثرا في مجتمعاتها على النظام السياسي فيها وعلى السياسة الخارجية وعلى الموقف من فلسطين تحديدا؟
Non, je ne crois pas qu'on puisse comparer les deux choses. D'abord parce que le mouvement de mai 68, il a été massif dans les universités, mais il a été massif dans la société. C'est-à-dire qu'on a eu la plus grande grève de l'histoire française qui a eu lieu en mai-juin 68. Donc, ce n'était pas tout à fait les mêmes choses. On peut dire aussi que ce mouvement de mai 68, il a été surtout un mouvement qui concernait la société française, la politique française, la volonté d'un changement, etc. Mais il avait été préparé quand même par les grandes mobilisations qui avaient eu lieu en France dans les années 60 sur la guerre du Vietnam. Donc il y avait aussi une dimension internationaliste de ce mouvement, mais il n'était pas central en mai 68. Donc là, aujourd'hui, on a un mouvement qui est sur une question internationale et qui ne peut pas avoir la même ampleur que mai 68, à part que les conditions ont totalement changé, les forces politiques sont plus les mêmes. Enfin bon, on peut faire quelques comparaisons, mais je ne crois pas qu'on puisse comparer.
You know, it's very hard to say because even if you think back to the Vietnam War protests, it's not like the U.S. abandoned imperialism and militancy after that happened. And a lot of those student protesters became, you know, investment bankers and the yuppies of the 1980s. So people who were very much committed to business rather than peace. But I do feel that these protests are unprecedented in American history when it comes to Palestine solidarity, and that a lot of students will grow into their careers and will become influential, knowing that the pro-Israel orthodoxy cannot continue as it is.
مهما تكن نتيجة هذه الاحتجاجات وأثرها المرحلي على المجتمع، سوف تترك بصمة عميقة في المستقبل، وسوف تسهم في صناعة جيل على مسافة أقرب من القضية الفلسطينية. البعض يقول إن الغرب يتحرك فقط عندما يذبح الفلسطيني، وبعد وقف إطلاق النار تنطفئ الحماسة من جديد. ولكن في الأفق مبادرات أخرى كتشكيل اتحادات شبابية خاصة بتحرير فلسطين. فهل تدخل الحركات الطالبية في الغرب على خط الفكرة المؤمنة بالثورة المستمرة؟